The trembling of the silver fork against the porcelain plate was the only warning Amara had before the heavy oak doors of the dining room crashed open. She didn't have to look to recognize the aggressive footfalls dominating the sudden hush of the restaurant. She knew that arrogant, stomping rhythm perfectly. Malik. He didn't navigate the tables, he marched through them, a muscular force in a fitted red t-shirt, his broad shoulders brushing aside a waiter as if the man were nothing. Months of blocked numbers, changed locks, and looking over her shoulder evaporated into thin air as he cast his shadow over her table. His jaw was locked tight, his thick brows pulled low over a suffocating glare of jealous rage. "You think wearing a fancy black dress makes you untouchable now, Amara?" His voice didn't just echo in the high-ceilinged room, it acted as a physical restraint, locking her muscles in place and stealing the breath from her lungs in a surge of practiced terror. Sitting directly across from her, Jae-hyun Kang did not blink. He didn't shift in his chair, and he didn't signal the hovering security. Dressed impeccably in a tailored black suit with a slightly open white shirt, he simply remained seated. His dark, cold eyes tracked Malik's aggressive forward lean with the chilling, composed focus of a predator watching a frantic insect. Then came the escalation. Malik snatched the goblet of red wine from the table, his grip white-knuckled. "Let's see how elegant you look now." The world went crimson. The shock of the cold wine was nothing compared to the burning heat of humiliation as it splashed violently across her chest, ruining the front of her evening gown. Amara gasped, her hands flying to her chest in disbelief, her wide eyes locked in embarrassment as the entire dining room fell into a horrified, paralyzed beat. She waited for the shouting. She waited for Malik's inevitable explosion. But Jae-hyun simply adjusted his posture. With terrifying, deliberate slowness, his hands moved to his left cuff. He unfastened the button and rolled back the crisp white fabric, exposing the intricate, dark scales of a dragon coiling up his forearm. His face radiated a quiet, lethal authority. Amara realized in that breathless second that while Malik had come to intimidate a victim, he had just interrupted the quiet reign of a king. The restaurant, once a sanctuary of soft jazz and clinking crystal, had become a tomb of absolute silence. Amara sat paralyzed, the cold wine on her skin feeling like leaden weights, while Malik stood over her, a sneer of triumph etched into his face. He looked around the room, basking in the shock he had caused, oblivious to the fact that the predator in the room had finally decided to stand. Jae-hyun Kang didn't shout. He didn't demand that Malik leave or call for the manager. Instead, he moved with a controlled, predatory grace that made the air in the room feel suddenly heavy, as if the oxygen were being sucked out by his very presence. Jae-hyun came around the table, his movements slow and deliberate, his eyes never leaving Malik's face. Malik turned his aggression toward the man in the expensive suit, his muscular chest puffed out beneath his fitted red streetwear couture shirt, a mocking laugh bubbling in his throat. "Who the hell are you supposed to be, her new bodyguard?" Malik barked, but the bravado wavered for a fraction of a second when he noticed Jae-hyun's expression. It wasn't anger. It was a terrifying clinical detachment, the look of a man about to remove a minor stain from a piece of fine silk. Without a single word, Jae-hyun reached out. His hand, pale and steady, shot forward with the speed of a striking viper. He didn't punch, he gripped. His fingers closed around Malik's wrist, the one still tense from throwing the wine, and squeezed. Amara heard it then, a sickening sharp crack that echoed through the vaulted ceiling of the dining room. Malik's eyes went wide, his mouth opening in a silent gasp of shock before a guttural howl of pain finally tore from his throat. Amara watched, her heart hammering against her ribs as Malik was forced to his knees. Jae-hyun didn't look down at him, he looked through him, his grip on the shattered wrist never loosening. The violence was so quiet, so efficient, that it felt more like a surgical procedure than a fight. Malik tried to swing his other fist in a clumsy arc of rage, but Jae-hyun simply shifted his weight, catching the second fist midair and twisting it with a nonchalance that made Amara's stomach churn with a dark, forbidden relief. It was a Mafia verdict delivered without a single gavel strike. As if summoned by the sound of the first bone breaking, the shadows at the edge of the room began to move. Two men in perfectly tailored dark suits appeared from the periphery, moving with a lethal synchronized purpose. The restaurant manager, who had been hovering near the kitchen, suddenly went deathly pale and took 3 steps back, bowing his head in a gesture of absolute submission. Jae-hyun finally spoke, his voice a low, terrifyingly calm vibration. "Remove him," he said, not even glancing at the 2 men who had flanked the struggling, sobbing Malik. "Ensure he understands that this city is no longer large enough to hold both his presence and hers." The men in black hauled Malik upright as if he were made of straw, dragging him toward the rear exit, away from the prying eyes of the other patrons. The golden light of the restaurant chandelier seemed to dim as Jae-hyun led Amara toward a waiting black sedan, his hand a steady, grounding presence against the small of her back. As the car pulled away from the curb, the city lights blurred into long neon streaks, a stark contrast to the heavy, windowed silence of the vehicle's interior. Amara sat stiffly in her ruined black dress, her eyes fixed on Jae-hyun's profile. He had rolled his sleeve back down, but the image of the dark, coiling ink she had glimpsed earlier burned in her mind like a brand. She realized with a jolt of clarity that she knew nothing about this man. The polished businessman who had just systematically dismantled a man twice his size without breaking a sweat was a fiction. "You're wondering about the ink," Jae-hyun said, his voice cutting through the silence with a quiet gravity that made Amara's heart skip. He didn't look at her, he kept his gaze on the passing cityscape as he slowly unbuttoned his cuff once more. He pushed the crisp fabric up, exposing the intricate, swirling dragon that climbed from his wrist to well past his elbow. In the dim light of the car, the scales of the dragon seemed to move, a masterpiece of shadow and needlework that felt ancient and predatory. "My grandfather wore this mark when he first came to this city," he began, his tone devoid of pride, sounding more like a man reciting a heavy, inherited history. "In our world, the dragon isn't just art. It's a ledger. It represents territorial control, protection services, and the things that exist in the shadows where the law refuses to go." Amara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the wine-soaked fabric clinging to her frame. She had spent months begging the authorities for help, carrying restraining orders that Malik treated like invitations. She had desperately wanted a protector, someone to stand between her and the chaos of her past. But as she looked at the dragon on Jae-hyun's arm, she realized she hadn't just found a shield. She had invited a shark into the water to deal with a scavenger. Jae-hyun finally turned to face her, his dark eyes searching hers with an intensity that demanded she look back. "The rules you lived by let a man like Malik hunt you. My world has different rules. We don't wait for permission to be safe. We take it." Amara pulled her gaze away, looking down at her trembling hands. The realization was a terrifying paradox. For the first time in nearly a year, she felt genuinely safe. But that safety came from a man whose very existence was built on the threat of violence. She had traded a loud, undisciplined bully for a silent, disciplined predator. Malik was a fire, wild, destructive, and exhausting. Jae-hyun was the deep ocean, calm, vast, and capable of crushing anything that dared to disturb his peace. The fragile peace Amara had felt within the walls of the Kong estate shattered 3 days later with the shrill, frantic ringing of her phone. It was Sunday morning, the kind of quiet day that usually offered a reprieve from the world, but the caller ID showed her mother's number, and the vibration felt like a warning. When she answered, her mother's voice was high and brittle, a jagged edge of panic cutting through the line. Malik hadn't come for Amara, he had gone for the people she loved most. He had shown up at her parents' home, violating the restraining order with a brazenness that suggested he no longer cared about the consequences. He had smashed the windows of her father's car and left a note taped to the front door, a jagged handwritten promise that Amara was still his property and that anyone standing in his way was a target. Amara sat on the edge of the guest bed in Jae-hyun's house, her knees pulled to her chest as she listened to her father take the phone. His voice carried a heavy, helpless weight as he explained that the police had taken a report and left with a sympathetic shrug, citing a lack of physical evidence. Amara realized with a sickening jolt that her attempt to protect them by staying away had only made them more vulnerable. To Malik, her family was just a set of levers he could pull to force her back into his orbit. An hour later, a text message arrived from an unknown number. It was a photo of her younger brother walking out of his university library, unaware that he was being watched through a telephoto lens. He was wearing a vintage-style Manchester United football jersey, looking completely defenseless as he crossed the campus. Below the image, a single terrifying sentence appeared: "Rich friends can't be everywhere at once." The air in the room grew cold, the sophisticated luxury of the estate suddenly feeling like a gilded cage that kept her safe while her world burned outside. Malik wasn't just stalking her anymore, he was hunting her heritage. She was a city under siege, and the monster had just breached her final line of defense. Amara paced the length of the luxurious guest suite, her thumb hovering over the call button for the local police, then her lawyer, and finally her brother. But she knew what they would say. They would tell her to stay calm, to document the threats, and to wait for the slow, indifferent limbs of the legal process to finally move. But Malik wasn't a legal problem, he was a violent one. He was a man pouring all of his remaining rage into a desperate, destructive fire. She stopped pacing. She realized that her hesitation to fully accept Jae-hyun's help was a luxury she could no longer afford. If she wanted her family to breathe again, she had to stop being a victim and start being an ally to a power that Malik actually feared. She dialed Jae-hyun's private number, her hands shaking, but her voice coming out sharper and more determined than she had ever heard it. "Malik is at my parents' house," she said. "He sent me a photo of my brother. He's threatening them because he can't get to me." There was a pause on the other end of the line, a silence so absolute it felt like the world had stopped turning. Then Jae-hyun's voice came through, a low, terrifyingly calm vibration that immediately stilled her frantic heart. "Where are you right now?" he asked. "In the guest wing," she replied. "Stay there." "I'm coming to you," he commanded. When Jae-hyun arrived minutes later, he took her phone, his eyes narrowing as he studied the photo and the threatening text. He didn't look angry, he looked focused, like a mathematician solving a problem that required his attention. "The police won't do anything until someone gets hurt," Amara whispered, looking up at him. Jae-hyun stepped closer, his presence a wall of ironclad control. "I am not the police, Amara," he said. "I do not wait for the injury to justify the cure." He looked at her directly, challenging her to accept their reality. "I can upgrade your family's security today. I can have men at your brother's campus before he leaves his next class, and monitor your parents' home. But it comes with a price," she noted, her voice steady. "The price is your trust," he replied softly. "You have to stop running from me to run from him. You have to decide if my world is a problem or a solution." Amara looked at the man who had broken Malik's grip without a single shout. She took a deep breath, finally stepping across the threshold into the dragon's world. "Do it," she said. "Protect them. Do whatever you have to do." The black sedan glided through the rain-slicked streets of the city, its tires whispering against the pavement as it approached the heavy iron gates of the Kong estate. Amara sat in the back seat, her gaze fixed on the passing blur of high stone walls and security cameras that pivoted with silent, robotic precision. This wasn't just a home, it was a fortress, a world built on the foundation of unconventional success. As the gates groaned open and then slammed shut behind them, Amara felt the final thread of her old life snap. She was no longer a woman living with a useless restraining order. She was a guest of the organization, a variable in a high-stakes game she was only beginning to understand. Jae-hyun led her through massive mahogany doors into an entry hall that smelled of expensive cedar and centuries of tradition. They were taken deep into the heart of the estate, past rooms filled with artifacts, until they reached a set of double doors guarded by two men. These were the silent, lethal shadows who acknowledged Jaehyun with a sharp, synchronized nod. Inside the private sunroom, the air was thick with the scent of jasmine tea and the weight of unspoken expectations. Seated at a low table was a woman whose elegance was so sharp it felt like a warning. Beside her rested a striking, hyperrealistic blue ballpoint pen sketch, a disciplined piece of art that mirrored her own controlled demeanor. Madame Kong looked like a monarch who had seen empires rise and fall and had personally signed the paperwork for their demise. Her dark, piercing eyes didn't waste a second on pleasantries. "You are the woman my son has risked our public anonymity for," Madame Kong said, her voice a low, melodic chime that carried the force of an order. Amara sat, keeping her back straight and her chin up, despite the way her heart hammered against her ribs. She felt the woman's gaze traveling over her, measuring the width of her shoulders and the fire still flickering in her eyes after months of Malik's attempts to extinguish it. It was a cold, clinical evaluation. Madame Kong was determining if Amara was a liability who would break under pressure or a queen who could stand beside a dragon without flinching. Association with this family is an acceptance of responsibilities that would crush a lesser soul, Madame Kong continued, pouring tea with a hand that didn't tremble. "I need to know if you have the spine to survive the world that created my son." "I didn't come here seeking a rescue," Amara replied, her voice steady enough to make Jaehyun's posture relax just a fraction. "I came because the world I was living in allowed a monster to hunt me with impunity. I am not looking for someone to hide behind. I am looking for the power to make sure the monster never looks back." Madame Kong allowed a thin, razor-sharp smile to touch her lips, not a sign of warmth, but a sign of recognition. "Good. Submission would have concerned me." The rooftop terrace of the Kong estate offered a view of the city that felt like looking down at a map of a life Amara no longer recognized. She stood at the railing, the night wind sharp and carrying the distant, low hum of a world unaware that her rules had entirely changed. Behind her, the soft chime of the elevator and the familiar scent of cedar and cold air announced Jaehyun's arrival. He didn't crowd her, he gave her the space she had spent months begging the world for, standing just far enough away that his presence felt like a choice, not a cage. Stepping forward to rest his hands on the railing, Jaehyun's sleeves were rolled up just enough to hint at the dark dragon coiling beneath the fine fabric. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored jacket, pulling out a small, heavy envelope and setting it between them. "Inside is a new identity, a passport, a bank account with enough to ensure you never have to work again, and a ticket to a city where no one knows the name Amara Ndlovu or Malik Okoye," Jaehyun said, his voice cutting through the wind with quiet gravity. He didn't push it toward her, leaving it as a simple offering. "If you take it, my men will escort you to the airport tonight. You will be a ghost, and the monster will never find you." Amara stared at the envelope, the ultimate escape she had dreamed of for months. She thought of Malik, of the way he made her believe that fear was just the price of being a woman, making her feel like property that needed to be kept. She looked at the blank check, then back to the composed, cold eyes of the man beside her. "If I take that ticket and run, I'm still letting him win," she said, her voice growing stronger with every word. Picking up the envelope, she held his gaze and firmly dropped it back into his hand. "I'm tired of hiding, Jaehyun. I'm tired of being a ghost in my own life." She stepped closer, wrapping herself in the heat and steel of his presence. "I don't want a ticket to another city. I want to stand my ground." Jaehyun nodded, a slow, deliberate movement that felt like a sentence being signed. His hand closed around hers, sealing her choice to finally stop being the prey. The Metropolitan Art Gallery was a cavern of glass, white marble, and curated silence, but to Amara, it felt like the belly of a waiting beast. Moving through the crowd in her elegant black evening dress, she played the role of the honorary host flawlessly, though she knew she was actually the bait in a trap designed with clinical, lethal precision. Jaehyun's voice was a low, steady vibration in her earpiece, a grounding sound that tethered her to reality whenever the room began to spin. He gently commanded her to breathe, assuring her that Malik wouldn't make his move until he believed the stage was empty. Every face in the sophisticated crowd felt like a potential threat, yet Amara took comfort in knowing that half of the caterers and security guards were actually Jaehyun's men in disguise, their hands resting near concealed weapons beneath their tailored uniforms. The plan had been heavily debated. Jaehyun had been deeply reluctant to use her as the lure, his protective instinct warring with the strategic necessity of catching Malik in a final, undeniable act of criminal intent. But Amara had insisted, completely tired of the useless restraining orders and determined to be the one to pull the monster into the light so Jaehyun could finally put him down. As the main lights dimmed for a scheduled cinematic presentation, plunging the gallery into a wash of deep blues and flickering shadows, Amara slipped away. She retreated into a private, darkened viewing room at the back of the hall and closed the heavy door behind her, the silence instantly absolute and heavy with the metallic tang of adrenaline. "He's in the service corridor," Jaehyun's voice murmured in her ear, his calm tone now replaced by a razor-sharp focus. The door didn't creak when it opened, it simply breathed. Amara didn't turn around immediately, keeping her gaze fixed on her own reflection in the darkened window. She saw his shadow before she felt him, a looming, muscular presence that looked frayed and diminished compared to the chaotic force she had once feared. Malik had bypassed the security gap Jaehyun had intentionally left for him, blindly believing he had finally outsmarted the billionaire and found his way back to the woman he still considered his property. Finally, Malik whispered, his voice sounding like dry leaves skittering across stone as he stepped into the dim room. "No bodyguards, no cameras, just us, Amara." Amara turned slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs, but her voice and posture remained terrifyingly steady as she faced the shadow that could no longer break her. "I'm not yours, Malik," Amara said, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly cold register. "I'm the last mistake you'll ever make." The heavy viewing room door didn't just open, it exploded inward with a force that made the glass partitions rattle. Jaehyun Kang entered with the same clinical, predatory grace he had shown at the restaurant, but tonight his sleeves were already rolled up, the dragon fully exposed. Moving with a speed that defied the human eye, he caught Malik's thick wrist, applying a brutal, precise pressure that forced a guttural howl of pain from the muscular man's throat. As Malik clumsily tried to pull away, the shadows of the room peeled apart. Jaehyun's men stepped into the light from every entrance, their weapons drawn and focused with surgical precision. The gallery trap had snapped shut, and Malik was the only one who hadn't realized his sentence had already been passed. "You don't touch her," Jaehyun said, his low, vibrating voice filling the room as his men pinned Malik's face to the cold marble floor. "You don't even breathe the air she inhabits." Hours later, the fluorescent lights of the holding area hummed with a sterile, buzzing indifference, a stark contrast to the velvet shadows of the Kang estate. Amara walked down the narrow corridor, her heels clicking against the linoleum with a steady, rhythmic finality. Jaehyun walked a half-step behind her, a silent wall of tailored wool and lethal intent, his presence ensuring that even the air in this building obeyed his rules. When the heavy reinforced door unlatched, the sound was like a gavel striking stone. Inside, Malik sat slumped at a metal table, his hands cuffed to a central bolt. The man who had loomed so large in her mind, the muscular chaos of her nightmares, looked incredibly small in the harsh glare of the room. Jaehyun didn't sit, he moved to the corner of the room, his dark eyes fixed on Malik with a clinical, predatory watchfulness. Amara pulled out the heavy metal chair and sat down, her back straight and her hands resting calmly on the table. The cold, liquid fear that had defined her life for nearly a year had evaporated, replaced by a strange, heavy sense of iron. "For months, you made me believe that I was small," she said, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. "You didn't ruin me. You just cleared the way for the woman I was always supposed to be." She stood up, reached into her purse, and pulled out the folded, tattered copy of the restraining orders she had carried for months. She placed it on the table in front of him. "I don't need this anymore," she whispered, turning her back on his hollow defeat. "Because after today, you are a memory I have chosen to delete." The floor-to-ceiling glass of the penthouse suite offered a view of the city that no longer felt like a labyrinth of hiding places, but like a kingdom laid out in a grid of golden light. A year had passed since the red wine had ruined her black evening dress, and the sharp crack of a breaking wrist had echoed through a quiet restaurant. Yet the woman standing in the high-rise was unrecognizable from the one who had sat trembling across from Jae-hyun Kang. Amara Ndlovu leaned against the cool glass, her silhouette reflecting back as a sharp, elegant line of midnight silk. She was no longer a victim living in a state of constant anxiety. She was a woman who occupied the sky. On her left hand, a flawless diamond caught the city's glimmer, a testament to the moment Jae-hyun had knelt not out of obligation, but out of a choice that was absolute. The overwhelming silence that used to haunt her was gone, replaced by the quiet, hummed efficiency of a life governed by the Kang organization. Over the last 12 months, Amara had done more than just hide behind the dragon. She had learned to breathe fire beside him, launching her own highly successful business, Verdict Consulting, using the same strategic mind that had survived her toxic past to navigate the cutthroat world of international business. Malik was a name she hadn't spoken in months. He was a ghost, exorcised by a legal system that had finally found its teeth once Jae-hyun's men provided the unconventional evidence required to keep him behind bars indefinitely. A soft chime announced the opening of the private elevator, and the familiar scent of cedar and cold night air filled the room. She didn't turn around, knowing exactly where he would be. Jae-hyun approached her with that same predatory grace, but as he reached her, the lethal edge was entirely absent. He stepped behind her, his arms wrapping securely around her waist, his chin resting gently on her shoulder. "You're thinking about that night," he murmured, his voice a low vibration against her skin. "I was thinking about the woman I used to be," Amara replied, leaning back into his heat. "Because I'm not just the girl who was humiliated anymore. I'm the woman who survived, the woman who chose, and the woman who thrives." As they stood together overlooking the city, the dragon and his queen, Amara realized that the ambush hadn't been the end of her story. She had traded a life of fear for a life of protected power. And as Jae-hyun kissed her under the light of the stars, she knew she would never settle for anything less than being cherished. Up here, in the silence of the high-rise, Amara was finally and completely home. If you enjoyed watching Amara step into her power and build her empire, hit that like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where you're listening from. I want to know who's riding through this story with me. Did Malik finally get the justice he deserved? Let me know your thoughts down below. Thank you so much for tuning in and being part of the Whispers in the Underworld family. I'll see you in the next one.